Delighted to have the opportunity to present this paper here. It's a joint work with Scott Hurst, and we look forward to your reactions. Okay, so it's a longer paper for which we apologize. If any of you ever reads the whole thing, email us, we'll send you a box of chocolates or something else. It does have a lot of moving pieces, different parts. Part of it develops, building on our earlier Journal of Economic Perspectives framework, builds an agency cost theory of index fund stewardship. The second part, the bigger part, is put together hand-collected and public data to piece together a picture of the full range of the stewardship activities of the big three, and we conclude that the body of evidence is overall consistent with the agency cost view that we put forward. And then we put forward some policy proposals as well as identify implications to some of the heated ongoing debates on hedge fund activism, common ownership, and the like. Okay, even though it's a long paper, it's part of kind of a larger body of work that we have been involved. As I mentioned, the paper builds on the analytical framework that we put forward in an earlier paper from the Journal of Economic Perspectives with Alma Cohen. We recently issued some supplemental empirical evidence on the rise of the big three, suggesting that the big three are on the way to become the giant three, and that we estimate would cast as much as 40% of the votes on average in S&P 500 companies within 2 decades. For anyone who doesn't know, the big three are BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, the large index fund managers, which we explain in the paper. There are reasons to expect heavy concentration by dominant players in that space. Another paper draws out more fully than we do in this paper the implications for common ownership. That's the misguided attack on common ownership paper, and we have some further work in progress. Okay. The agency cost view is just a term to describe an approach. As all of us would agree, the stewardship decisions of an index fund are not made by the beneficial investors, but by the investment fund managers, which means we might have agency problems. And the benchmark we use for evaluating decisions is comparison to the decisions that would be optimal for beneficial investors. We do not argue as to how the outcomes in today's world compare to an hypothetical world in which the shares were held not by the index fund, but by individual investors or by active funds. We compare them to what would be optimal for the beneficial investors. You might say, why focus on that? You could say, well, by definition, we'll always have some agency problems. But the reason why we think this is a useful benchmark and a useful lens on this subject is because, one, we think that the agency problems are a first-order driver of the stewardship decisions of index funds. And you cannot really understand those decisions without carefully analyzing the agency problems. And secondly, the analysis of the agency problems is not just to complain and kvetch about the state of the world. It's also because it gives you a way of thinking that can enable you, and we try to go in this direction, to find ways to limit or reduce the cost of those agency problems, and therefore enable index funds to deliver more on the promise that some suggest they have. Okay, there are 2 types of incentives problems that we identify, going back to the JP paper. for index funds as well as for active funds, but now I'll focus on index funds. One is with respect to the quantitative dimension, how much you invest in stewardship. There is a strong incentive to underinvest in stewardship relative to what would be optimal for your portfolio, for your beneficial investors. Secondly, with respect to the qualitative choices you often make, it's not that you spend more money on stewardship, but with the same voting decision, you can be more or less differential vis-a-vis the managers. I mentioned this in my comment earlier in the day. We argue, we analyze and conclude that index funds have strong incentives to be excessively differential to corporate managers because of three sources of private benefits from being differential. Only one of them has to do with business relations. Another one that I'll mention because we think it's important is the fear that if you won't be differential, if you throw your power around, you might have to fear a regulatory backlash. And that's something that might lead you to try to behave in a way that one would not make managers strongly resist you, and two, will not make your big power too salient. Okay, let me turn to the evidence. We have a much fuller analysis of incentives in the paper. And we analyze both what the index funds, and here we'll focus on the big three, what the index funds do, and what, in our view, they fail to do. So first of all, what they do. So in terms of the investment in stewardship, which was one dimension. So each of the big three we document, they have hundreds of positions that have a value of $1 billion or more. You could imagine that for such a position, it would be worthwhile, even if you could improve value only by 0.1% on an expected value basis, it would make it worthwhile for you to have perhaps multiple professionals dedicating perhaps a substantial part of their time to monitoring the company and interacting with it. That's what major VC firms do, even for positions where they don't have control. They just have a limited position, but they still have dedicated professionals. Now, supporters of index fund stewardship have focused, and big three leaders have stressed the fact that they've increased their stewardship staff considerably over the last several years. But we place a spotlight on where they are now. And where they are now suggests that investment in stewardship might leave something to be desired. So this is stewardship investments. We basically take their stewardship reports. We look at the numbers of people. We make some conservative assumptions and so forth. So first of all, the bottom row here indicates that the stewardship expenses, even though the big three leaders stress that stewardship is fundamental to their mission and what they do, stewardship investments and budget are a fraction of 1% of revenues. More importantly for our purposes, if you look at the resources, the personnel time, it might seem arguably, so we argue, insufficient for the task. So this is, we take the number of people that they have. We make some conservative assumptions about them not taking lunch and going on few vacations and working all the time on stewardship. And we do different scenarios as to how they allocate. You know, one scenario at the top, they allocate it equally among companies, or they allocate it proportionately by market cap. They allocate more to the US. Even under the the scenario that gets to the largest numbers, which is scenario 4, you see that for each $1 billion position, they are able to they have on average between 1.7 and 3.2 person days a year for that $1 billion position on average. Some companies perhaps more, maybe if there is an activist engagement, but some companies that would mean less. Now, if you want to think about these 3 days, just look, and we did this research, if you just look at the documents that seem important and we list them to take a look at for forming some judgment, you see that the documents the company issues are in the hundreds of pages each year. And there are a number of other things that we explain one needs to look at. I think that the numbers suggest or raise concern that the stewardship staffing of the big 3 enables them only a limited and cursory review on average, or at least for the large majority of their portfolio companies. Second thing that they do, and they stress, is they engage in behind-the-scene communications. Vanguard, for example, stresses, and you might have read similar observations from other big 3 leaders. They say private engagement is perhaps more important than other elements of our stewardship. Engagement is where the action is. So the argument is you'll see soon that various tools are not used. But the argument is instead they use behind the scenes, invisible communication, which is more effective, and that's where the action is. So we use the information in the stewardship reports to get a sense of how much of this is going on, because they give the numbers and the types of engagements they have. And what we see is that for roughly 83 or 90%, there is no communication whatsoever during the year. Out of the about 10% where there is a communication, the great majority, 7 to 10%, it's a single conversation, single phone conversation during the year. And it's only between 0.7 for State Street and 6.9 for Vanguard, where you have more than one conversation during the year. So what this leads us to conclude is that they don't have engagement, private engagement, behind the great majority of companies. And therefore, for this majority of companies, private engagement cannot be a substitute for the use of other stewardship tools to which I shall presently turn. Okay, third thing that they do, and many of you are familiar with it, is they focus on what we call governance principles-based stewardship. We go over various things, document that that's what they focus on, deviations from their governance principles. This is consistent with the private interest of the big 3 managers. It enables economies of scale that reduce the required investment in stewardship. And it also makes the power of the big 3 less salient by grounding what their decisions less in discretion than in kind of general governance principles. Now, some of it is definitely good, definitely produces benefits, but we argue that it also fails to take advantage of some potential benefits that can come from stewardship that is based on attention to business performance or individual director qualifications, and that's something that let me turn to now. Okay, so let me turn now to what they, in our view, largely fail to do. First, little attention to performance. Performance is important for the beneficial investors of index funds. You don't need to hear what the slides say to agree with this. We analyze what the big 3 do, and we see that they pay very limited attention to business financial performance. You look over at all the case studies, and there are many of them described in the stewardship reports. In none of them is underperformance mentioned as a motivation for the engagement. You go over all the proxy voting guidelines as to whether you vote for directors or you withhold support. And none of them, they take into account governance principles, but none of them takes into account financial performance, none of them, to say it precisely, in none of them would it make a difference on the margin whether you have outperformed the market by 20% or underperformed the market by 20% in the last 3 years. Now, you could say, could this be explained? Could it be explained that the big three lack expertise and access to information to identify operational improvements? That's what hedge funds do. That's suggested by one of the papers in the literature. In our view, this lack of in-house expertise, which is true, should not be taken as given. This is an endogenous choice that the index fund managers make. Surely they have the resources, if they saw this was advisable, to hire hundreds of MBAs from Getty University, from Stanford, Chicago, and so forth, and do much more analysis. So this, the fact that they don't have it is really a product of incentives. Could it be also argued, alternatively, that they don't do this because the hedge funds do it? Gibson and Gordon makes a version of this argument, suggesting that the index funds can rely on what the index funds do. For us, this is not a valid explanation because, one, the hedge funds engage only when underperformance is very large and can be fixed quickly. Otherwise, they don't have incentives to do it. And it might take them quite some time to arrive. So there is a vast number of cases where the beneficial investors would benefit from paying attention to business performance. Secondly, another thing that they fail to do or do too little is they pay little attention to many important director characteristics. You can imagine two directors that from adherence to governance principles look the same. All independent, same process produced them. But one of them might be Jamie Dimon, who is a great business leader, and another of them might be your idiot cousin. And in a contested situation, people would pay a great deal of attention. But if you look outside the small number of activist proxy fights, you'll see, for example, if you look at the proxy voting guidelines, you see that they would not give any weight in choosing whether to vote for or withhold support to any such characteristics. Now, could it be, somebody might say, they don't do it in the voting, but in other communication, they have influence behind the scenes, so the people who come up for vote are people like Jamie Dimon and not your idiot cousin. Well, our evidence that we collect indicates that the answer is no to this hypothesis. And we gather data about 4,000 situations in which the big three held 5% or larger positions during the last 10 years. In this kind of a situation, if you have more than 5% and you communicate with the company about director X shouldn't be there or director or individual Y should be there, you have to file a 13D. We look at the data, we find that not a single 13D was filed by them during this long period, and therefore we can infer that they avoided any communication based on analysis of director qualifications in their engagement. Okay, next. Many of you know that proposals by shareholders on some issues where you can get majority support, you focus on things for which there is broad support among investors. They have had considerable influence, made changes for majority voting, annual elections. And you might think that not in general use shareholder proposals for things that are controversial, but for the things that are strongly there in the big three principles. You would think that it would be natural for them to actively push for those changes because the big three do focus on general conformity with governance principles. And a large number of their 5% plus positions do not comply with their own governance principles. However, when we look at the data, we find that among the 4,000 corporate governance proposals that were submitted during the last 10 years, including, most importantly, the very large subset that uniformly received support from the Big Three, none of those proposals were submitted by the Big Three. Now, somebody might say, well, they don't need to do it because other shareholders are doing it, and therefore they just give their support, and it's happening. However, if you look at the data, you see that because of the limited resources of small investors, proposals for many of the changes that the Big Three favor and that you can expect with practically 100% probability they would vote for and they would welcome if there were proposals on the table, those proposals are not brought in any given year, or sometimes they are brought only after 10 years. As a result, a large fraction of the Big Three portfolio companies lack arrangement that they very much support, and submissions of shareholder proposals in those cases would pass and would bring about changes that by the own governance principles of the Big Three would be desirable for the beneficial investors. Let me just conclude with the last thing that they failed to do, and I'll skip the policy discussion if it comes up in the Q&A. They also, the Big Three, in our view, they hold positions in many companies. And therefore, if you had wide-scale governance reforms, even reforms that had a small, relatively small effect in any given company, such reforms could have significant benefits for the portfolio of the Big Three, and therefore would be beneficial for the beneficial investors. But we collect, the hand-collected evidence that we put together shows that there is actually a pattern of limited involvement in this area. Two things. I have time just to mention two things. One is we look at all the comments letters that were submitted on all the 80 SEC proposed rule changes in the corporate governance area in the last 10 years. Our expectation is that since the Big Three hold roughly 20% of the equities in all those companies in the whole US stock market, you would expect them to express a view on each of those proposals on the table, either to say, we like it, we support it, we are against it, or even if you think maybe they are indifferent to something because they think it's practically irrelevant, that's also something, given that there is a limited attention and resources for the SEC, it would be valuable for them to say, this is something that is unimportant and shouldn't get significant part of the SEC attention. However, what we find when we collect all the comments on the SEC website, we go over them, we see that the Big Three submitted comments regarding less than 10% of the proposed rules, either when you look at all the rules or even if you look at the rules, the top rules in terms of the attention they got. And if you look at cases of precedential securities litigation, there were 10 important cases in the last 10 years. About 100 amicus briefs were submitted by affected parties, were often cited by the judicial opinions. However, the Big Three remained fully on the sidelines. They did not file a single amicus brief in any of these three cases of precedential litigation. We think that this is also consistent with the agency cost view because it might be safest from your private interest perspective to stay on the sideline. If you explicitly support pro-shareholder reforms, that might annoy managers. If you explicitly oppose reforms, that might make your deference to managers' interest too salient. Possibly the safest, most careful thing is to stay on the sidelines. Okay. There are a lot of policy implications in the papers, implications for debates. Let me stop here and just state our conclusions that the evidence we have collected is consistent with the agency cost view of index fund stewardship that we have put forward. That given the rise of index fund ownership, the two agency problems that we have identified deserves the close attention of policymakers, market participants, and all the corporate governance scholars in our field. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So the first thing I'd like to do is congratulate the authors. This is already forthcoming. The second thing is I completely agree with ECGI when they awarded the prize to this paper. It's a tour de force. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mostly focus, there's three big parts of the paper: the theory, the evidence, and the policy implications. So I'm going to focus more on the thing I get paid for, the evidence part. I don't know as much theory-wise, but let's just start there, and then I won't say too much policy-wise, but I think there are many people around the room who can contribute more to what can be done. So the first big picture or theories, we all think about the separation of ownership and control. All of us are aware of the phenomenon that we have a paradigm, the US paradigm of dispersed and atomistic shareholders that causes free rider problems. It's very well known, but there have been changes. The first change the paper's speaking to is there's the rise of collective investment vehicles. They could be mutual funds, pension funds, and so forth. They are large, they're professionally managed, and you could expect them to perform some more monitoring functions through voice, through exit, a number of the concepts we'll hear through the day. But they can introduce a double agency problem. They themselves are intermediaries, and so that could be a problem. The second change is within this sector, the intermediaries are switching from actively managing their portfolios to more passively managing their portfolios, whereby they take the tenets of modern portfolio theory and things I teach in the business school environment, and together with scale economies, and you now see the rise of the big three. And that is reconcentrating ownership in the end. So you had the atomistic model. We all said you should form all the same portfolios. Guess what? They're now being formed by this top three. So that's where the paper sits in. And I think it's very timely. It's very important to address these issues. We should not be ignoring these issues. The world is not the US, however, and we're not in the US right now. So it is true, I don't have a pointer, but it is true that there's high institutional ownership in the US. There's somewhat in between when you're out here in continental Europe, you're closer to that in the UK, but the other parts of the world are not necessarily the same way. But you do see the rise of institutional ownership throughout the world. So that's the good news is this is some data I've used. So I thought maybe actually spend some time with this data to learn about the big three. So that's what I decided to do. So within that institutional ownership, which is now plateaued at 75% in the US market, 50s or 40s in Europe, and maybe 10, 20s in Asia Pacific, in Asia, let's just figure out who are the top, who are among those institutional investors, who are the top. So what I did is maybe one visualization is take who is number one, who's number two, all the way to 5, and I'm coloring them the big three, the State Street, the Vanguard, and BlackRock, versus the traditional active ones, the Capital Group, Fidelity, and so forth. And you do see this big change since the financial crisis, 2007 and 8, in the ordering. So the big three, okay, definitely becoming bigger. The world is not the US, right? So you're probably in agreement with that statement. But there are data for other countries, and myself and my co-author Miguel Ferreira, we've had multiple papers using that, but we also made that data available on Words or facilitate access to other researchers. So what if you were to doing the same, like who are the top 3 around the world? I myself didn't know this so well. This is my best attempt at doing it. But so just to highlight, blue means passive or big 3, and orange would mean the traditional active. So with one exception, which is Canada, that data is a little bit old, so now it's become true that Vanguard and BlackRock have finally penetrated Canada's market for mutual funds. They had a hard time, but it's interesting, both in continental Europe and in places like even Brazil or Japan, BlackRock and Vanguard are coming in. So it's the very same big 3, and it's not just in the US. But number 4, which we'll hear from later, is the Norwegians, okay? So that's a big player, and Vicente, I think you have a paper in the afternoon about them. That's another one we should be considering. But it's the same 3 around the world, and someone else, some small, minuscule country with a lot of oil that's investing throughout the world, and they're popping up all over. So what fraction do they hold of the market? I spend more time on the data than Lucian does, but I think it's very complementary just to add more numbers to Lucian's argument. They now hold 20% of the 75%, so 20% of the total, outstanding shares is in this 3, and you could project, Lucian has another paper where they project this out, where can you end up in 5 years or 10 years? That can be 30, 40% easily by the time you finish the next paper, okay? So this is something one should be studying. But where is it, how is it in other countries? Again, I break down North America, Europe, and other places. Blue is still minuscule. It's still only 3 to 5%. This data, of course, needs continuous updating. This data is of 2015, but it's maybe 5% now by 2017, 2018, 2019. Still low, but growing. What's behind this? It's that we've been teaching this to MBA students through generations, but many investors are becoming aware that actively managed funds, on average, underperform this passive strategy. So this is one way to visualize that. The S&P puts it out. It's shaming the active managers. 80% of them underperform S&P-based indexed funds. Same deal in Europe. You can go through any tab you like. Any market you choose, this evidence is fairly consistent within a 5, a 3, a 10-year window. Of course, every single year you could have a slight variation in these numbers. So investors are flocking out since they've become more aware of costs since the financial crisis, out of actively managed into those passively managed products. And the rise of ETFs is sort of that. Now, I'm kind of using the word passively very, very loosely here. Many ETFs are fairly active because they might be the only ones that are tracking that specific index. And they might be called, different things. So I'm just using what, maybe let's use it then the word top 3 rather than the fairly passive. So the theory that I mentioned, I'm not going to spend too much time, but you could think this is going to resolve the issues that Berlin means the dispersed ownership problem was causing. The reconcentration of ownership could be a good thing because they're universal owners, so they can incorporate externalities across firms all over the world. They can have large stakes, which makes them meaningful. They have no choice to sell, so it means they will have to engage. They will be long-term. There's no plan to sell. They can be near permanent. So that's Ian and others have papers on this. But the bad side, which Lucian's pushing and giving evidence for, is that what are really the incentives? Like, if they're collecting so little fees, if you go to a world where fees are zero, and you're not that far from that world, or fees go negative, which some are already introducing because they have security lending and other sources of revenues. So what would be the budget for this type of monitoring activities? Or the second channel that Lucian talks about is being differential. What is their business interest to be opposing corporates? Because they have businesses like running pension money for corporations. They may fear backlash, as Lucian pointed to. So Lucian and co-authors have a sequence of papers on that side. I'd say that's the good and the bad side. The ugly side, I don't know if you ever watched the movie, right? I mean, that's a third side to this, which is Martin and others' papers that are pointing to this could introduce even bigger issues, like the keiretsu that are sort of embedded in Japan or chaebol and other cross-ownership structures that exist can play itself in the US context or internationally. I'm not going to take a stake on all this debate, but I'm just highlighting the three sides. On the evidence, do I still have any minutes? Or? Okay, so let me spend some time. So this paper forced me to look at the evidence. I was truly, thankful for Lucian to make me do this, because I didn't know all these numbers that well. This is as of 2017, these numbers. They've gone up a little bit. BlackRock Stewardship team is probably the largest, and 33. I think last year at the ECGI, we had their commitment that they were going to grow that number to 75 from the vice chairman, that they have plans to expand that, but they're still like maybe at 40 or 50 as we speak. Vanguard is smaller, and State Street is 11 individuals. So it doesn't matter how much you pay them. They're not well paid. They're not the best paid people in the organization, for sure. If you divide that by the AUM or divide by the fees, the numbers, Lucian's numbers are pretty stark. Nothing to do about those. But the next question I asked was, what is the counterfactual? Like, yeah, you do have these top three. What about the other ones? How much are they spending? So I went to look. And Morningstar actually had a survey on this. So the way you should read this is take the top three, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, and the next ones. The next ones tend to be more blend. They don't have just purely passive blue, but they will have more reds, like actively managed products. So Fidelity comes up mostly on the active side, although they do manage some index products as well, or Deutsche or UBS, etc., which will be more blend. And then what I did is I went to count how many staff do the other ones have. So is this a big deal? I guess so, because they are actually the ones that have the highest staff compared to the other ones. So not to be too bad to Deutsche Bank, I think they've taken beatings every day here in Germany, but they have 3 dedicated staff in the asset management arm, as surveyed by Morningstar. Morningstar sent out this survey, and they responded, we do have 3 individuals doing this work. So this is very important, because I think we shouldn't stop in the top 3 without comparing to the alternatives, right? The next thing is how much are they underinvesting, not just stuff. You know what, it comes and goes. The other thing that Lucian forced me to do is I ended up reading their stewardship reports. I haven't done that, I should have. And like, what's there? I just show you the index. It's a lot. So it's not like they're not doing anything. It's very deep, types of analysis. One item there is private engagement. So that's the second dimension that Lucian has in the paper. I found very useful as well. How many companies, percentage-wise, in your portfolio do you engage? And that's like, I inverted the numbers a little bit, but that's only 10% or 17% or 9% of your portfolio. Again, low, I agree. But what about the other institutions? You guys want to look? Okay. So there is data on the other institutions. So with one exception here, that they are among the ones that do the most. So yeah, it's 10% of their portfolio, but percentage-wise, but actually in number, Fidelity would say 0. They don't engage. Why? Because they may have an alternative mechanism, the exit mechanism, or the sell the shares mechanism rather than the voicing mechanism. I think it's worthy of pursuit academically to study these things, right? What would have been the alternative to? So in this case, they do have the largest staff, although small, albeit small, but they also have the largest number of engagements compared to the other ones. Who they are, you have to go to their appendices. Vanguard does not disclose, but the other two do. So you actually have their names. I won't spend that time. I was doing this on the plane. I didn't have enough time to go out and give you the exact companies and whether that caused any outcomes. Well, we should be studying those things, I think, as a profession to study. The third, I think, part of the evidence that Lucian puts out is there's no engagement that's caused by financial underperformance. Again, we have this debate about whether they support or not the hedge fund activists. I didn't have any evidence I could show you there, so I agree with the point. I think that should be studied more. Proxy voting. How many votes are we had Enriqueta and others talk about, what is the percentage of dissent? It's typically small, right? Voting against management is typically a low number. It's 2 to 5% for these institutions. Again, the question is, what is compared to others? And what is it compared to ISS or Glass-Leos? Like, what if you didn't want to take on the due diligence yourself, but hire ISS or a proxy advisor to do that? So that would have been my comparison, I would say as well. There's also data on that. Good. So I don't know where we come out on that, but there's, on average, they vote more with management. They're more in the 91, 94, 86, and some of them might be in the 78, 77 for the other ones. But we should be comparing and understanding these differences. Is this statistically different or not statistically different compared to others as well? Director selection. So that's, as Lucian pointed out, there's no director nominations were found because they would have to disclose a 13D rather than a 13G. I just couldn't find the data, so I will not have much to say on that. Or shareholder proposals. There is some data here, so I thought I'd show you, which is as you correctly pointed out, the big three do not seem to submit any single proposal, but we have actually their votes on shareholder proposals compared to the others. And I've run out of time to organize this information, but the way you read this is the blues, the ones I circled, are the top three. The others are not top three, and I only had Fidelity there and BNI, Mellon. And the categories, climate change, environmental, gender diversity, and stuff like that. So it would be good to study as well. What is the difference between these two? I visually find somewhat less votes for shareholders, but it would be worse. On the last one, corporate governance reforms, Lucian did compare them to public pension funds. That's the other comparison group I would advocate. And I would just put a pitch for the next ECGI conference, which is in Riga, if you have a chance to join us on Monday. They may not be lobbying the SEC for reforms, but they might be lobbying other groups. So whether it's the index providers on the case of dual class shares, where they've been going out to exclude them from indices, been very vocal on those, because they might have given up on the SEC, might have given up on stock exchanges and might be going a different route. So I will not say much about public policy, as I said, but just congratulate again Lucien to forcing me to learn more about this, and I encourage others to contribute with future studies to this topic.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Pedro. Thanks for the kind word, for kindly encouraging people to read. If anybody of you reads the paper, we send a box of chocolate both to you and also a box to Pedro upon receiving your email. Now, just 3 reactions to some kind of bigger picture comments. First of all, thanks a lot. This was very useful and very interesting. And there are things there that would help us revise the paper. Reactions to some big picture comments that are useful to relate things that we do to other things. So one thing that Pedro stressed is, how does that compare with active managers? And I mentioned early in my presentation that for us, that's not the relevant question. We're not asking the question of, would it be better if the active managers had those shares or if individual investors had the shares? We actually have another paper in which we are looking at the active funds, gathered data that in part is similar to what Pedro showed you. And we actually find that there are substantial problems, both of excessive deference and underinvestment there as well. And that it's not the case at all that in general, active managers are better than index funds. So you might say, so then why are you complaining? Because we think that's not the right question. Think about corporate governance, the agency problem at the level of operating companies. When we have controlling shareholders with agency problems, we don't say, wait, but are those better or worse than the agency problems of corporate managers without controlling shareholders? What we try to do is, and we agree that sometimes those are larger and sometimes those are larger, but in general what we are trying to do is, in each context, we are trying to understand the agency problems and reduce them. And what we should be doing is we should try to figure out as fully as we can the agency problems for the index funds, the agency problems for the active funds, and try to reduce both of them. And how they compare on average at any point in time, it's not something that should lead us to accept things as they are. 2 other quick comments. On the common ownership, well, thanks for saying that they are the ugly and not we, so that's but some people conflate our work with that because both works are in a way critical of index funds, but they are critical in opposite directions, and what they are normatively trying to push goes in opposite directions. The concern in the common ownership literatures is that the big 3 are doing too much. They are using their power too much, and what we should do is kind of slow this down and scrutinize them more. And our concern is not that they are doing too much, but rather that they are doing too little. And we think that therefore the music and the discourse arising from the common ownership literature is pushing the system in a wrong direction, because on the margin it can chill beneficial engagements on the part of index funds. And the last comment on, can we explain the fact that the big 3 are standing on the sidelines by saying, look, they've given up on the SEC. Maybe they're also not submitting amicus briefs because they've given up on the courts. But those bodies are making real decisions. Those are decisions that actually have an effect on the world. Those are decisions that then finance professors go and look at the announcements returns when those are made. So they are going to make decisions one way or the other. And therefore, if you own 20% of the US stock market, we think that it would be beneficial for your investors, for you always to be attentive and always to try to move the needle a bit in the positive direction. And that's why staying on the sideline for us is more consistent with the agency cost view than with the value maximization view. Thanks, Pedro, again.
First, Jack, and second.
So I want to make these remarks in a somewhat polemical way because it's more fun. So it seems to me that the way the issue has been conceived here is exactly the wrong way, because it does not accept the fact that the innovation of the index funds is really diversification across the market, across the economy as a whole. So firm-specific governance intervention is idiosyncratic. It can't improve the performance of the portfolio. It can't make the beneficiaries better off, it seems to me. And indeed, it does run the risk of the common ownership critique. So to follow the point here, any direct action by the index funds along the lines that have been suggested would deprive them of the best defense that they have against the antitrust claim, which is to say, we don't have a channel. We don't have a way in which we can influence, so therefore that there happens to be this, the parallel action, that's not on us. So don't come after us, so don't threaten the business model that is good for our beneficiaries because we don't play a role. So first, firm-specific governance intervention can improve the beneficiaries because of the fact of it's all idiosyncratic. And secondly, the effort to do so would put at risk the very low-cost model that the beneficiaries want. The follow-on point is that the real issue is what is the role for systemic stewardship? That is to say, you know, the finance theory is all about how do you improve the performance of a portfolio. Well, you can improve expected returns, or you can reduce risk, systematic risk. And so it seems to me the real challenge that the big three need to figure out is the role that they want to play in systematic stewardship. And the climate change stuff that they may be involved in, the stability, social stability stuff that they may be involved in, each of which may have the potential to reduce systematic risk. That's where I think we ought to be focusing our efforts to help them to figure out the role that they can play and ought to play.
Okay. Thanks for this polemical intervention, which was still very kind in delivery and more gentle than I feared. But let me try to defend what we do to the best I can. So one, I agree with you, we all agree with you, that there is some benefit from systemic improvements. Some people believe that staggered boards are bad, then let's eliminate all staggered boards. Some people think independent directors are good, let's always have independent directors. That's systemic, that's something that fits their model very well. Even there, even if you completely buy this, we have a problem of underinvestment and excessive deference. Why? Because the big three, if they wanted all firms to have annual elections fitting their systemic optimal system, they could easily get it, okay, within 3 years. But no, as Pedro mentioned, they always vote for this. But what it means is that companies that don't have staggered board, it depends on the happenstance of whether John Chevedden, who is a well-known individual investor, happened to have them in the portfolio, or some Harvard shareholder clinic happened to submit proposals that year, but then when the professor stopped teaching it, it doesn't happen. That doesn't seem to be the systematic approach that you're advocating, because if you really think that you shouldn't have it, then you shouldn't eliminate 100 staggered boards this year just because there were more proposals, and then afterwards you just wait and do nothing for the others. Similarly, if you believe in systematic, intervening in governance reforms in general, that's exactly the most natural step you would expect them to do. But as we documented, that is not happening. And you mentioned the investors want them to do it in a way that is not expensive, because the benefit is, for index fund investors, is that it's cheap. And in the interest of full disclosure, most of my portfolio is in index funds. So I'm a direct beneficiary. However, the numbers we had on the board suggest that if they quadrupled their investments, that would have no material effect on their costs. Because right now, I mean, if they are charging 5 basis points, if they went the full way of implementing everything that we say, that might go up from 5 to 5.04 basis point. Okay, so, and most of the stuff that I've been discussing is not very expensive. Lastly, you said that for things that are company-specific, that requires company-specific knowledge, that can't be beneficial for you beneficial investors if you're holding a diversified portfolio. I don't think that that's correct. That's correct if the improvement that you are giving to company X would enable it to make profits at the expense of company Y, and then it cancels out. But let's suppose that the problems are, like what I mentioned before, you have, idiot cousins serving on some boards. One idiot cousin doesn't cancel the other idiot cousin, right? So, except, just if it's about a strategy that, they compete with each other. But, it might be that the idiot cousins are just sleeping at the headquarters, and all the companies have a slack. So generally, we would think, and we have a lot of evidence in financial economics, that we improve governance arrangements, and sometimes it's on a company-specific thing. The performance of firms economy-wide goes up, and value goes up. And therefore, if they did the various things that we were mentioning, so for example, if you generally pay more attention to performance, and that has both ex post and ex ante effects, that might have an expected average effect that would be positive across all the firms in your portfolio, and that's what you would expect to see and what you would want to see under the value maximization view. Sorry for the length, but I had to, given that you describe it as polemical, I try to defend.
We ran out of time, so I will accommodate on last comments.
Okay, I'll make it very quick. I think on the theory side, you seem to be obviously right, because there's dispersed investors and they go through an intermediary. They have to be agency costs, and there's a collective action problem at the intermediary level and so on. I think that's clear. And the question then is, how bad is this problem? So the empirics, that's where the empirics come in. And I had one reaction, or two reactions. One is what's the benchmark, and Pedro made that in his comment. But the other question is, for some of your measures, like submissions to the SEC or plaintiffs, being a plaintiff, named plaintiff in a securities litigation, the big funds, they go through the Investment Company Institute when they make submissions to the SEC, or when they make other interventions in policy. And for litigation, they tend to opt out of the class and actually get pretty large settlements, or in litigation much larger than the class action lawyers get. So they are active in that sense.
Actually, in the next revision of the paper that would be even painfully longer, we give evidence that kind of fully addresses this and shows that those are cannot explain what we view as too little activity. So on the reform, I mean, you could say they don't need to do something because the Investment Company Institute, which is their trade group, is doing something. One, this wouldn't be clearly a good answer because the Investment Company Institute aggregates active funds, short-term active funds, and long-term index funds. And one of the things that the big three often say is we are very different, we have different interests. So you would think that they would often want to have their own position because of their special circumstances. However, let's assume that there is always overlap in interest between the active funds and the index funds. If you add the comments by the Investment Company Institute, we still get substantial lack of involvement. The Investment Company Institute is very active. You know when? When you are talking about regulation of mutual funds. Mutual fund fees, lots of activities. But if you go to the corporate governance reforms, or if you go to the presidential litigation, those cases, and you add the investment company submissions, you don't get any change in the overall picture. And on the opt-out, we actually looked at the numbers. And yes, there are few cases in which they opted out, but we are talking about a very small number of cases over the last 10 years, and out of a sample in one of the studies, 2,000 cases. So basically, the standard mode of the big three is outside a very small handful of cases, is not to take an active role in plaintiff litigation, even when their stake is quite substantial in terms of either percentages or dollars. Thanks.
Thank you very much.